Want to welcome everybody. It's 4 o'clock. I guess we're going to get started because we want to get as many of your questions in as possible. So hello, welcome. I am Shelley Latham, the community manager for LinkEngineering.org. And Link Engineering is an educator exchange for PK-12 educators who are interested in incorporating engineering into their classrooms. It is a project of the National Academy of Engineering, and it is sponsored by Chevron. We want to thank Chevron for their sponsorship. If you haven't been to the site, I really encourage you to check it out. There's a lot to do there, plenty of resources, and it's a place where you can actually link to other educators who are doing engineering. And I know a lot of you are members, and thank you for that. And I want to, this is the first of our video conversation series. So if it's a little bit rough around the edges, that's why. But we do have some other conversations coming up. On May 1st, we've got Playful Learning, Making Engineering Fun with Anne-Marie Thomas. And on May 15th, we've got Say Yes to Teaching Engineering, Overcoming 6 Common Fears with Christine Cunningham of Engineering is Elementary. And those are great. We're excited to have those opportunities coming up. And so, hello, and I want to just introduce our presenters today. Cary Sneider, he just very recently received the Robert H. Carlton Award for National Leadership in the field of science education. Congratulations, Cary.
Thank you.
And he is a visiting scholar at Portland State University in Portland, Oregon, where he, for a long time, was the associate research professor and teaching courses in research methodology in a Master of Science teaching degree program. He's also a chair of the Link Engineering Committee and serves as a consultant on STEM education for a number of foundations, including the Noyce Foundation, Stephen Bechtel Jr. Foundation, and on many advisory boards. He's also a writing team leader for the Next Generation Science Standards, and he is the editor of a 3-volume set, The Go-To Guide for Engineering Curricula, that was published in 2015. Did I cover everything pretty much, Cary?
You got it.
All right, good. And joining Cary is Nancy Schalch, who has been teaching engineering, robotics, and environmental science at Beverly High School in Beverly, Massachusetts for the past 19 years. And she was part of the advisory team of educators for Engineering the Future, Science, Technology, and the Design Process, a teacher guide published by the National Center for Technological Literacy at the Museum of Science, Boston, and she met and worked with Cary on that project. And prior to that, Nancy was an environmental and energy engineer working with state agencies and nonprofits on energy efficiency and conservation. So thank you so much for being here, both of you. I'm really excited about this. And a little housekeeping for the rest of you. Cary's going to start us off. We've got some slides, and we'll do just sort of basic introduction to engineering kind of basics, the process and concepts, and then we're going to go quickly to your questions. And we very much want this to be a conversation. So chat is open, but if you could send your questions through the Q&A at the bottom there, that would be helpful to me. And hopefully we'll get your questions answered today. And if not, we can follow up after the fact. So with that, I'm going to go back to screen share, and Cary's gonna take us through some basics.
Did you want to ask questions first about?
Oh yeah, actually I wanted to thank you for reminding me, Cary. I want to do my poll. If I can find my cursor, where did it go? That's the problem with two. That's the problem with two. There it is. Okay, first poll is just tell us what grade level you primarily work with. And if you're an educator, that's what grade level you're teaching. If you're an administrator, if you provide resources to educators, just tell us what grade level and just so we have an idea of.
That will help Nancy and me as we're thinking through what we want to say and what we want to emphasize. So.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll leave that open for a few minutes more. We're almost got everybody answered. I'm going to switch over to the screen share.
Okay.
And lost my cursor again. Ugh. It's that 2-monitor thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Here we go. All right.
So,
and, yep, go ahead.
Can we see the results of the poll?
Yeah, we've got not quite everybody has voted yet.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But that's okay. We can end it here and see what we've got. Looks like slight majority there of middle schoolers, and nice even split between elementary and high school. All right. So take us away, Cary.
Okay. So a few words, first of all, about what it is that we're talking about. And again, I apologize. This is very elementary for some of you, but I always think of the process of engineering as a means of solving problems and meeting people's needs. So the important things about it is a process, and it's a purposeful process. Some have called it design under constraint, which is a little too brief for me, but a way to think about it is that there are always constraints. There is usually money, time, or materials, or a deadline, and you've got to make something that works. That's a very different process for science, but it belongs in a science program because it's really the application of science and mathematics to solving real problems. So it's systematic. It's not a helter-skelter hacking trial and error approach. And it's iterative. That is, you try to solve the problem and you see how well it works, and then you see what's the problem with it and you improve it. So it's also very social and collaborative. So teamwork is critical. And teamwork, helping kids develop the ability to be team players, really starts in early elementary school. That's really a major aspect of that. Next slide, please. Often the engineering design process, because it is systematic, is presented as a series of steps. But they're not necessarily steps you take 1, 2, 3 in order. It's like there is no such thing as the scientific method. There is no the engineering design process, but it is a process. And one of the important elements of it is to be clear about what problem you're solving. And before you try to solve it, you see how other people have solved it, or you try to understand the problem and what are the needs that it needs to meet. You come up with a number of different solutions rather than just going with the first thing that occurs to you. There's a process actually for selecting what the best solution might be based on your definition of the problem. And often you will construct a prototype or build a computer model and test it and find out how well it works. An important part of it is communicating it, and so communication is very important. And then often once you get it out there and see how well it works, it's necessary to redesign it. But at any stage, you can always go back and say, are we still solving the right problem? Have we generated enough ideas because this one isn't working? So it's not a simple, it really involves a number of steps. But as we look at the next slide, what we just saw really was primarily developed for middle and high school students. Christine Cunningham, who will be on one of these webinars very soon, realized that that's a little too complex for elementary. And so she and her team came up with this 5-step plan. Ask, imagine. So you ask is similar to, understanding what the problem is that you're trying to solve. Imagine involves coming up with a bunch of different ideas, imagining what the solution could be. And then once you have a pretty good idea of what you want to do, you plan it. You plan to build something or test it. You create the thing you think will solve the problem, and then you try to improve it. And the way you improve it is you try it and see what worked and what didn't. So they're very similar, but this is just a simplified version of it, and also an easier language for kids. Next slide, please. Often, these approaches are shown in terms of a cycle, in the sense that once you've solved a problem, new questions always come up. That's why you go from the Wright brothers airplane to the current jet engines that we have today. Each time you try something out, you see how you can improve it, and you improve it again and again and again, and that's sort of the cycle of research and development. Whether you're talking about elementary or middle or high school. Some people say, oh no, it's not really a cycle, that you always have a starting point and an ending point. So there are many different ways of drawing these pictures. Next picture, please. So what we did when we worked on the next generation science standards is we realized that we did not want to throw the weight of the NGSS behind the particular elementary or high school program of any particular curriculum. So, but what we wanted to say something about it being a systematic, thoughtful process. And we wanted a picture. People really like pictures. So we thought of it as, you know, every single design process has these three phases to it. There's always a phase where you're trying to define the problem. There's always a phase where you're developing and testing solutions. And then there's a phase where you take what you've developed and you see how well it works and you improve it. It's called optimization, to make it not just improved it, but as good as you possibly can. And then once you've done that, you've defined a new problem. So this is the approach used in the next generation science standards. Do we have one more slide, or is this?
Yeah, we do. Just to touch on habits of mind, and a lot of these concepts that Cary is talking about will hopefully be elaborated on and discussed in sort of greater depth and with some examples of how that plays out. But the habits of mind being these skills that are developed through the engineering process and doing engineering. So this is, I love the term habits of mind. It was actually introduced back in the 1980s as part of the AAAS Science for All Americans, and later called the benchmarks. And Kristen Cunningham recently identified several of these for the elementary level. And so these are the capabilities that really develop all the way along. Some people call them 21st century skills too. The idea that engineering is a creative process, it's optimistic in that you always assume that there is a solution, and that in order to solve any problem, you got to be persistent and try again. It involves a really systematic way of thinking, conscientious, to really keep in mind you're solving a problem for others. So it's very much a helping profession. And then collaboration and teamwork, of course, is really important. So what I'd like to do is just give a couple of words of introduction for Nancy. And I know you did a wonderful job, Shelley, but I want to say a little bit more because Nancy and I have known each other for, nearly a couple of decades now. And I lived in Beverly, Massachusetts for some time. And we were developing this curriculum called Engineering the Future, and we needed to work with teachers. You can't really develop curriculum when you're sitting in your office. And Nancy and a colleague of hers, who was a technology teacher there at the time, worked together, and both of us really did a fabulous job. We just recently revised the curriculum, and Nancy helped out again. And so Nancy is one of those people who was really a pioneer in this field. So Nancy, if you could tell us about what you do, about the classes that you teach, how it fits into the science program at Beverly High School, and in particular, what kinds of experiences the kids have in your classroom. That would be great.
All right. Sorry, I've got a very old dog in the background who wants attention right now. So yeah, I've been teaching a variety of courses, primarily engineering at the high school, and have tried to, the high school wanted students to have that perspective of problem solving that goes beyond traditional science classes, which they of course also have, but the recognition that there's a lot of need for people who can problem solve, and there's a huge array of professional pathways in the world of engineering. So I think it has been really helpful. We've got a lot of students who announce that they're going to go into engineering in college because I think they're exposed to it the way I wasn't growing up. So our students, we try to expose them to a whole lot of skills that help them be better engineering designers or use the design process. So to do the design work, to come up with creative solutions, we make sure that they learn how to draw, and we practice technical drawing skills, and we learn about materials, and we learn about, I've put a fair amount of time into energy because I want them to see the connections between what engineers do and some of the problems or the challenges we face in this world. We talk about electricity, and we learn about hydraulics and pneumatics and structures and forces, all sorts of really cool things. And wherever possible, I try to make sure they're making connections with their own lives and with career paths. So that definitely opens their eyes up. I have students who I see years later who are doing computer engineering, or they're doing civil engineering, or they've picked a profession that actually had to do with something they learned in our class. So that's been very exciting to see. It blends nicely with the other science courses, and we do, as Cary mentioned, there's certainly a connection between the scientific method and the engineering design process. And we try to practice that enough that they are comfortable solving problems throughout the year. We do a lot with group projects. I try to give students the opportunity to focus on individual responsibilities within teams, but they do an awful lot of collaboration, which is sometimes challenging, but generally they come out the other end with much better projects and with great skills about learning to listen and blending their strengths and becoming confident in the areas, for example, drawing. I've got a lot of students who don't have any comfort with drawing when they walk through the door, but now they can explain their ideas better. So we've got a luxury at the high school. It's a full year course like any other science course, so we get to dive into a lot of different topics. I think you can do it in more condensed way if you don't have that luxury. The design process is so critical to prepare these students for life.
That's a wonderful discussion. Let me, if I may, just highlight some of the things that you just said, if I may. So you talked about they're becoming familiar with a lot of different technologies, like hydraulics and pneumatics and drawing and so on and so forth, which is critical because people go through life, the technologies are all around us, but we don't really learn how they work. So that's one important thing. It relates to their lives. So electricity is something we use all the time. Well, what is electricity? How does it work? How can we use it and actually design circuits? So careers, and there are 4 careers in engineering for everyone in science in this country. And NASA hires 10 engineers for every scientist, which always amazes me.
Wow.
So those opening of those career doors is really something we really need to do. And it's wonderful that you have done that. The relationship between science and engineering is also important. Scientists actually spend a whole lot of their lives doing, engineers spend a lot of their time doing science because to get their equipment to work. And often the reverse too. If you're doing engineering, you actually have to do some controlled experiments to find out really the best parameters for your device or something. And then the teamwork and collaboration, again, which is so important all the way along. By the time they get to your classes, Nancy, hopefully the middle school teachers and elementary teachers will have really helped these kids become collaborators and learn how to do that, because it's really a tough skill. It really takes a lot of effort to learn. So those are wonderful, wonderful explanations. Shelley, I know you have something to...
Yeah, Nancy, I was going to ask whether in your school district, are they doing engineering in the middle school level or elementary level? Is that something, are you seeing students, if so, are you seeing students coming to the high school now with engineering experience or vocabulary?
Definitely there's way more effort now than there had been when I first started teaching. Because we started at the high school and tried to work backwards. In general, most of the engineering concepts are taught by the science teachers, I think, with support of professionals who come and work with the teachers. They are doing more and more at the middle school. Again, it's a combination of the science teachers, plus they have some specialists. So I think they have access to a real shop. And I know that they're developing maker spaces at the school. And I know the engineer or the science teachers, when they're doing physics and other science topics, they try to build projects in where the students do go through the engineering design process, and then they apply it to the science they're trying to do. Mm-hmm. So they have very definite skills, but it's hard to, it's with so many teachers and so many different pathways. I would say we all, when we start teaching at the high school, we bring them back together again.
Mm-hmm.
Shelley, your question reminds me, and Nancy's answer reminds me of the map. Can you show the map just before we go to questions? Because one thing to keep in mind is those of you who are listening and who are in other states than Massachusetts might be saying that, well, in Massachusetts, obviously Massachusetts has these very strong technology and engineering standards. But in fact, those standards are all over the country now. The dark green states are those that have adopted the NGSS, in which engineering is the fourth discipline. So there's physical science, life science, earth and space science, and engineering is considered alongside the other four. It's something that's easy to forget. It's not just a way of applying all of the three science disciplines, the traditional ones. It's actually a fourth area of standards. And that's also true for the framework. The medium green framework are the medium green states are those who base their standards on a framework for K-12 science education from the National Research Council. And that is the blueprint for the NGSS. So that also emphasizes engineering. And then some of the white states that have not committed to either, some of the light green, by the way, are considering adopting those. And some actually, like Wisconsin, is white, one of the white states up at the top that is not green because it hasn't adopted the others. But I just looked at their standards yesterday because I'm going there next week. And I see that their standards are also very strongly based on the framework. So they also include engineering. So this is something nationwide, whatever state you're in, really, the idea of engineering becoming a critical part of science is becoming something that's widely accepted, that's really valuable and important to do. And we look to Nancy as a pioneer in this area to get a sense of well, what works, what are the barriers, and so forth. And so now I think we should get to the questions from our audience.
Yes, if you have questions, be they basic or less basic, or about applications in the classroom, or about larger concepts and curriculum issues, send them in the Q&A. that would be great down at the bottom there. And or in the chat, if you want to tell us if you're here because your school is going to be starting engineering, or your state has recently adopted these standards and you're curious and interested and wanting to know from there, or if you have some experience having your state already adopted that, if you want to let us know how that's going, or if you have any questions about that. I think that while people are coming up with their own questions, I have some. I'm ready to jump in here because I'm not an engineering educator. If you could talk a little more, Cary, about how engineering in an educational setting, how it plays with science and math and technology. And I want to just say that for the technology, I think I tend to go, and I think a lot of people go to like fancy technology, like computers and cell phones and, that kind of thing. But technology really is just anything that is man-made, like a hammer is technology. And I think that we sometimes, go to the fancier digital realm when we're thinking of that. So just how those all fit together.
Okay, so I see a question from John Olson over here.
Oh, okay.
That I'd like to address too, and say that there's a tremendous value in looking at the kids' experiences and to connect to those experiences, connect with their lives. So I noticed, for example, that Karen Umeda mentioned that the heavy rains are also on the east side of Oahu. If you are, by the way, this is my cat, Gibson. He loves going on, he loves webinars. He's a real star. So, so for kids who are in Kauai and the North Shore and Oahu and perhaps the other islands too, this is an event that is kind of big for them. And one of the standards, and I forget exactly which level it is, but I think it's middle school level, is developing solutions to protect humans because of natural disasters. And so what do you do as a solution? I know here in Oregon, it's okay. Yeah, beautiful fur, doesn't he? Here in Oregon, one of the problems is that we often get major roads washed out on the coast. What kind of solution could there be instead of continuously improving the road there? And that's a sort of question for which there are many different types of engineering projects. Now, John Olson asked about the science and engineering concepts, and I particularly emphasize the relationship between the two, because how you fix the road depends a lot on whether or not you're expecting another storm of this sort coming and when. So, for example, what we're seeing now is 100-year storms occurring every 5 years. Now, I know that sounds like a non sequitur, but the point is that with global climate change, atmospheric patterns are changing. What are those atmospheric patterns? How can we understand the earth science concepts related to climate? What is climate and how does it differ from weather, for example? So those are some science concepts, and they're intimately related with engineering problems. Now, an engineering concept that you don't typically find with science is the idea of trade-off. So, for example, if you're going to fix a road in a way that's not going to be washed out, it's going to be much more expensive. There's a trade-off there. Pay more money, but you get a fix that's more likely to last longer. An even more expensive fix would be to find another routing for your road, so it's not right along the coast. Again, there you may lose some of the beauty of the views or access to beaches. So that's another important concept in engineering, the idea of trade-offs that you don't encounter specifically in science. Nancy?
I just wanted to pipe in again. We talked about projects, and I just wanted to reiterate that engineering can be such an exciting project-based way to engage the students, and also connected with the concerns about lives and roads and housing. We just finished a project that I loved, and I had a lot of kids get excited about too, where they were asked to design a tiny house, which is a new thing out there, but specifically asked to design one for a homeless community, a street where or a block where they're working on providing more permanent housing, or for refugees or people who have lost their homes because of a natural disaster. And as a result, they've been asked to design something that is not only very small and very functional, but also as close to zero energy as possible and very low water use home. So they had to do a lot of research. They had to work collectively because everybody brought different expertise into the project. And they got to build a little model, which meant they got to, for the first time, really got to experiment with, on a miniature scale, how walls are framed, because they used stirring sticks for studs and to frame windows, and figure out how the light came in the buildings. And so it was a fun project that blended a number of themes, and they had also already researched the amount of electricity different household devices use, and solar panel, how many watts solar panels can put off. So it was a great way to blend a lot of ideas into something that the students collaboratively worked on and were very proud of and demonstrated. So the more you can bring in reality and problems that really do exist, the more it engages them. So one of the real joys of teaching engineering.
So let me build on this a little bit while you send us some more questions. Is that the project Nancy is talking about is actually one that we're working on together. One of the new activities that Nancy's been testing for us in the Engineering of the Future curriculum. But she has brought to it much more than the basic activity that we had in mind, and brought in issues that were important locally. Now, sustainability, of course, was one of the main points that is intended for that section. Tiny houses use much less resources than big houses, which is one thing to think about. But in a similar way, we had kids redesign a building, also in that same unit, here in Oregon, and they were about to have a new school, so we gave them the activity to redesign their own school. How would they do it? And they came up with some really amazing ideas that redefine the problem throughout the project. And it's another nice example of how this is not a perfect circle, this process. So some of the kids said, you know, we have this library, maybe it should be a community center for the community when we're not here. Bring in some of the people from the community, not keep the high school separated and isolated. And, you know, we have this big gym. Why don't we, and we have a lot of kids who have no homes. Why don't we invite the kids and their families to sleep here at night instead of sleeping under the viaduct and out in the elements? And we could, you know, make sure that when we design the building, it is separated so you don't have to heat the entire school, just heat the gym and make sure that there are extra bathrooms there. So really bringing it home, I think, is an important lesson here that I think Nancy has demonstrated. It needs to be related. And issues like social justice, where they're not typically discussed in a science class. They are perhaps in social studies, but again, here is a way to bring the subject areas together. And there's opportunities for science and social studies teachers to work together, as well as ELA and math teachers. So there are really wonderful opportunities through engineering to integrate the subjects and to break down the walls that typically cross between them.
I want to,
just one quick thing. One point I should make is that well, I'm working at a certain level with high school kids on projects, and we have we go into a fair amount of depth about the science and engineering of those topics. So much of what we do can be done at the younger grades, and there are certain things you simplify, but the concepts in engineering really work at all levels. It's just a matter of choosing what resources, what examples make sense, what you can have in the classroom to work with and engage the kids. So it's not strictly a high school curriculum by any means. There's so much that can be done.
So we have some elementary teachers out there, and I'm wondering if any of you who teach elementary can let us know what you do, and or if you have any. Shelley, is there any way to actually unmute somebody in our audience so they can talk to us? Or
I can play around with that. It is possible. Whether or not I'm able to pull it off is maybe a different question altogether. But if somebody has something that they want to say, if you let us know in the chat, I can see if I can click on you and unmute you.
in the meantime, I see we have a question from Linda Kekelis.
Yeah.
It says, how do you accommodate challenges that may arise in group work due to differences based on prior experience or differences in confidence levels of students? So Nancy, I think this is one for you.
So any teacher knows that you move your groups around a lot, at least I do. And sometimes I try to group people who I know are going to work at the same level, but more often I try to group people who bring different skills in. And with engineering, it's great to see those different levels of competence and skills work well. Sometimes I usually try to find out what their strengths are, or I figure that out before we embark on a big project, because I want to make sure there's somebody who's comfortable drawing. And then I usually try to get them not to be the person doing the drawing, but them to be the person coaching somebody else and giving them support. And I'll usually have somebody who wants to roll up their sleeves and be in charge of construction. And I usually don't let them be in charge of construction, but I want them to be part of a pair. And I do feel like everybody leaves a process, leaves a team project having skills they didn't think they had. It's not a perfect process. Everybody knows that, but I think by having them work in small groups and making sure that I try to give people, well, I usually let them choose jobs, but I make them rotate, and I make sure different people are facilitating and making sure that everybody has a job and is working. All those standard practices can make a big difference. And I don't know if I answered the question completely.
No, you gave several excellent answers.
Okay.
I have to share that I remember on one of our pilot studies, I remember a student who was very upset and angry. He said, I'm a member of a team of 3. I'm doing all the work. And how come everybody's getting the same grade? So I remember the way that teacher explained the way he would do things in future was, yes, he liked the idea of everybody getting the same grade for the same report from their project, but also each student got an individual grade based on specific things that he had each individual do. So, so there were, opportunities for whoever was doing a lot of the work actually to get extra credit for that.
Yeah, that's pretty standard. Whenever I have group work, I try to have individual deliverables, and it may be different pieces that they're in charge of, but I never want an entire group to get the same grade unless they feel that they contributed equally. And often they do, and often they learn, but I tell them part of the process is, if you're doing all the work, there's something not right here. you need to help make sure it's delegated, and you can coach, but your job is partly to make sure that other people are contributing.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me also that we had a questionnaire, I don't know if you use it, about teamwork, where students rate both their own teamwork process as well as their fellow students' teamwork processes. We didn't grade that because we really want them to be honest about that, but we discussed those ideas and made sure that the team talked about those ideas too. So again, it never gets easy to do this, does it? To help kids really learn to work well together.
There's another aspect of that. I think that we often think of group projects as being weighted to the stronger students who tend to take on a lot of it because sometimes working with other people is hard. But part of what I understand of the engineering design process is that getting that input from people who maybe are not usually the first person to raise their hand, or who maybe don't have the same academic strengths as other people in the group. Part of the message of the engineering design process is that all of those viewpoints are actually going to make for a better result. And I think it can be hard to get the smarty pants kids, the kids who are, sort of motivated and kind of high achievers, to sometimes step back and accept that some of the input that they might be getting on a project is actually really good and needs to be considered. So that seems like one of the skills that if engineering is being, introduced properly and with rigor, that there would be an opening for all of the participation if it's being done right.
So I see, Shelley, that we have a nice paragraph from Cheryl from Michigan.
Oh, great.
Would you mind reading her?
Yeah, no, not at all. Thank you. Cheryl says, I work with K-2 and love to do engineering with students. Over the years, I've woven engineering into much of my science using projects and Lego robotics. It seems like more learning takes place during those times, so I'm disappointed that many elementary teachers don't incorporate engineering into the curriculum. How do you inspire them to do this when everything depends on math and reading standardized test scores? I should note that I retired but went back to work substituting, but teachers still come to me with questions about NGSS. I'm Cheryl from Michigan, by the way. Thank you, Cheryl.
So there are some really interesting thoughts and questions embedded in that statement. One is Lego Robotics is a fabulous program, but it's also very expensive. And you don't have to have a lot of money to do engineering, because a lot of problems can be solved, a lot of types of problems can be solved with, stirring sticks and hot glue and other types of simple materials. And a lot of engineering too doesn't require any materials at all. They're solving problems. So for example, the cafeteria, redesigning the cafeteria and thinking how we can get kids through the cafeteria more quickly. That's an engineering problem that can be done with pencil and paper, and trying to figure out solutions to problems of that sort. A bus schedule is actually an engineering solution to a problem. So, so that was one of the things that I wanted to mention. The other issue, which I think is an even deeper problem, is the focus on reading and mathematics at the exclusion of science and social studies, and certainly engineering. For states that have adopted the Common Core, or other states who are adopting similar standards, the focus these days is much less on fiction. It's not that fiction isn't still there, it certainly is, as well as poetry and other forms, but also the ability to read and understand science materials and social non-fiction materials. That's a wonderful opportunity to bring in science in ways. Again, you don't learn to play basketball by reading about basketball. You learn to do it by doing it. But nonetheless, there is some value of reading. And so, for example, the engineering's elementary curriculum has a lot of readings that kids do, and the readings gives a context to a problem, and then they do an activity related to that. So, so anyway, there are opportunities to connect science and engineering with social studies. I'm sorry, with English language arts and with mathematics. You just do what I call a twofer. You get credit both for English language arts and for science if you do something that involves both. So it is true that the focus, by the way, there was a study done by Rolf Planck a couple of years ago showing, in fact, that even before No Child Left Behind in 2001, the amount of time given to English language arts and math was increasing, and science and math and social studies was decreasing. That law actually made things worse, and in some states, very few kids even do any science at all before 4th grade. So this is a major, major issue and problem. One way to attack it, where there is such a focus on ELA and math, of course, is to do a twofer types of programs. But I'm hoping that the country will change. Someone says in my state, I belong, this is from Karen Umeda, I think from Hawaii. In my state, I belong to a team of teachers who deliver the wonders of science and STEM PD to teachers statewide. That's great to hear. In our sessions, we show teachers how science and STEM can be integrated with selections in the Reading Wonders program. So there's a beautiful example. Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing that. And that's certainly one approach.
You touched on curriculum, Cary, and I know you've written a book about a curriculum guide. How important is that? I mean, curriculum, like that seems like a district-wide choice or a school-wide choice, as opposed to an individual teacher in a classroom choice. Just to speak to that, because some people, I don't know.
Okay, so Nancy, you may have a response also. I'll quickly give you mine. While I was working on the NGSS, after the framework was finished, I remember presenting to a group of people, during the process. This is what we're working on, what's your feedback, and so forth. And one fellow, Gary Tomlinson, who had spent years developing city technology, which is a very good curriculum having to do with technological design, said, Cary, why are you telling me this now? As soon as these standards come out, everybody's going to develop a engineering and technology curriculum, and they'll forget about us. So it occurred to me that everybody should know what Gary was doing, as well as a bunch of other people who had developed curricula for a long time. Not start from scratch. That's one of the things we know in engineering. You don't start from scratch. You see what other people have done first. So I was talking to a editor from Corwin Press at the time, and what we agreed to do would be to basically come out with a book by people who had already developed engineering and technology curricula. We don't say they're aligned with the NGSS because they were developed beforehand. So, but they're a really good starting point. And so we ended up with 40 chapters. Now, you can't have a book that's that thick. No one will buy it. And if you're an elementary teacher, you don't want the high school stuff, and vice versa. So we came out with 3 books. It's called The Go-To Guide to Engineering Curricula, and published by Corwin Press. And each one has about 14, 15 chapters. Those chapters are not written by the people who sell the curricula. They're written by the people who develop them. And the emphasis in every case is, what do the kids do in your program? And there's also a question about how well does it align with the NGSS so far? How do you assess it, and so forth? How do you find out about it? So with regard to your question, Shelley, you also asked, what about an individual teacher that wants to integrate engineering into their curriculum and the district is not going to buy another curriculum? Well, there are a lot of what you call enrichment modules in these programs, in these chapters. You don't have to buy a whole year's curriculum and all the kits and all the money that's associated with it. Mm-hmm. In some cases, there are just a little booklet that you can pay $20 for and give you a whole lot of ideas about how to get materials at the grocery store and the hardware store and give your kids an amazing engineering experience that you can attune to your high school or even social studies program or the science program. So there are many ways of doing this sort of thing, and I'm very pleased to say that this material, we've got 40 people who really spend a lot of time writing these chapters. NSTA carries the book, National Science Teachers Association, makes the book available also to its members. So they're in 3 separate books, K5, 6, 8, and 9, 12. So you can just buy the part that's relevant for you. Pardon me for plugging my book, but really what I'm plugging is the idea that there is a lot out there. And the last thing I'll say about it is that developing curricula is really hard because you really need to get other people to help you test it. So Nancy, for example, has been tremendously helpful. Without her, yeah, I could go and teach something that I came up with, but what if I send it to somebody else? Do they find it helpful? And what do they recommend for me to improve that? So we had quite a few people. The original version had 100 teachers actually test it. The revision that we recently finished had 6 people testing it in their classrooms and giving feedback. So it really is helpful to get curriculum materials, although you can come up with your own, certainly.
There's a lot of good ideas online too. Mm-hmm. And if there are design challenge websites, and so you can do some work just by deciding today is a day we're going to grab some materials and challenge the kids to do something and figure out ways to incorporate some math and figure out ways to incorporate a little bit of reading or writing. It can easily be done and not take up a huge amount of time and still be effective.
Right. And you also don't even have to pay $20 because there's so much free online. And we have 2 tips from Dodi Resendez, I think it says. Newsella and Tween Tribune from Smithsonian are great resources for expository reading. You can even get the articles at different textile levels. Textile, pardon me. Lexile. Not textile, Lexile.
I'd like textile levels.
And then also Linda Kekelis reminds us that this panel that we're on, Link Engineering, that's a great way to find engineering lessons. Now there's Link Engineering is associated with, of course, we're on Link Engineering right now.
Yeah. And
our website is closely associated with Teach Engineering, which has something like 1,000 lessons that are downloadable and very easy to use and adapt immediately. And you can search for items that are your grade level or related to the sorts of things you're doing. Now, Teach Engineering doesn't allow you to actually comment. If you've used one of the lessons, it doesn't allow you to comment on what worked well, what worked different, or how you improved it. But there's a link to Link Engineering where you can do that, because Link Engineering is all about building a community, people who are talking to each other like we're doing right now. And so those of you who are joining us today, let your friends know about Link Engineering.
Yeah.
And invite them to join. And I know we have some very good webinars coming up, but also people post things on this website all the time, which are really interesting. And you can ask questions, and Shelley will help direct your question to one of the experts who can help to answer it.
Yeah.
Including Nancy.
Yeah, Nancy. We've only got a few more minutes left here. Any other questions for our Panelists, anything on your mind before we go? It was such a nice segue and plug for Link Engineering and Teach Engineering. You can follow us on all sorts of social media as well. And we have a nice newsletter, which is a sort of, I'm not coming up with the word, but I gather all sorts of, fun stuff that's going on and opportunities. And that's another way of learning what's going on out there. And why don't I go, if there aren't any other questions right now, I'm going to go back to our screen just for a minute, which is our upcoming conversations, Playful Learning, Making Engineering Fun with Anne-Marie Thomas, who runs the Playful Learning Lab at St. Thomas, University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, and Say Yes to Teaching Engineering, Overcoming 6 Common Fears with Christine Cunningham of Engineering as Elementary and the Museum of Science, and just all around in phenomenal engineering educator, and largely responsible for the whole conversation of teaching engineering at the earliest levels. She has a book that has just come out, and this webinar will be basically all of the things that all of the hurdles that people put up that they're concerned about in starting engineering in their classroom. And so I think these are both going to be really, really fun and great for all age and grade levels. So you can find more about that and register at LinkEngineering.org. And I want to thank our presenters. This was not bad. I think we did it. We did it. We had a conversation on video.
By the way, I just finished reading Christine's new book, and it's excellent. It's a very, very good read. And she really tells the story of how she got started in this field long before there were any specific, long before the next generation science standards included it, and how one goes about developing curriculum. And how that changes over time, because developing curriculum is an engineering design process. Teaching, what all of you do every day, whether you're an administrator or a teacher, your engineering experiences for kids. And it is, it's not rocket science, it's engineering, which is a lot harder. So, thank you, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Shelley and Nancy.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and hope to see you on LinkEngineering.org. Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye, all.